this is David with the Time Rift Arcade, and I think you can see what our next restoration project is going to be, Baby Pac-Man. I've never actually worked on one of these before. This one here is not complete. It's actually missing the screen and the joystick, but this one here is more or less complete. It's going to need a little bit of restoration work, but I'm sure between the two of them, we can definitely get one of them working. So let's dig in. Just a few facts for you. This game was released in 1982 by Bally Midway. It was acquired by the Time Rift Arcade in 2024, some 42 years later. The first challenge is just getting the machine moved to an area where there's room to work on it. Since the arcade will be opening in just a few weeks, the shop is crammed full of machines waiting to be moved there. And here we are. So let's take a close look at the condition. Externally, it's actually in decent shape. The control panel artwork is cracked, so I'll probably want to replace that. And top it off, there's a mud dauber nest on one of the flippers. At least we did get the keys with this one, so we won't need to drill the locks out. Speaking of, let's open up the rear door and get our first look inside. There's some trash and a lot of spider webs inside, but nothing that looks like anything that would short out, so I think we'll just try powering it up. Okay, first power up. Well, that didn't work because I forgot to turn the power switch on. Here we go. Okay, so one obvious problem is the CRT is partially collapsed. But I noticed a far more serious problem when looking at the board set up close. There's corrosion everywhere, the worst I've ever seen. Even the PCB is delaminated. Yuck, look at that. Every single component is corroded. The cause is right here. This battery has leaked and has just destroyed this board. I consider it unsalvageable, and we'll come back to this in a bit. For the moment, we need to get the CRT removed and work on that. I mean, even if the board set was miraculously working, we wouldn't be able to see anything. This is a 13-inch color CRT, which by arcade standards is pretty small. On the bright side, that means it doesn't weigh very much, so it's easy to move around and work on. And here we go. Looking at this thing, I'm not even sure if it has ever been serviced before. It looks untouched by previous technicians. I had Ashton go ahead and take some pictures of it from all directions so we have a reference of how everything goes together. And then I started the process of disconnecting the chassis. And guess what? I can't remove the neck board. You know why? It still has the original adhesive from the factory. And look at these original factory cable ties still holding everything nice and tidy. And then there's this problem, a ground wire that will have to be cut. Of course, this is an easy enough problem to solve. I'll just crimp some connectors at each end of the cut. That way I can put it back together easily and it'll make it more serviceable in the future. But all of this leaves no doubt that I'm the first one to ever work on this thing. And here we go. I've got the chassis out and I'll desolder the first capacitor. Once it's out, I'll just check the voltage and capacitance values. Then I'll just look through our little store of parts and find the right value to replace it. I'll also put a dot on top to indicate that this cap has been replaced already. And now I'll solder it in place. After it's all done, we can have a moment of silence to thank them for their years of service before sending them to the great beyond. After recapping, I begin the process of reassembling the monitor. Okay, it's time to test it, so we need some power, and we'll also need a pattern generator for a video signal. I'll have Ashton power it up and we'll see what we get. And well, I was a bit disappointed at first. However, after I started playing with the adjustment pots, I realized that every single one of them was turned to some extreme position. I think when the screen collapsed, somebody was probably playing with all the controls to see if they could fix the issue, and thus they were just all out of whack. I got it adjusted to where it looked pretty good, but I still felt it could look better, so I asked the expert, Mike Woods, to have a go at adjusting everything. He did manage to make it look slightly better than me, but unfortunately it's just still a tad blurry. But probably not enough to really affect a game like Baby Pac-Man. You may notice a slightly discolored area of the screen, so the last thing he did was use the degaussing coil on it to get rid of that. And as you can see, that worked. Also, just for giggles, I thought it would be interesting to connect my Commander X16 to the monitor since it does support analog RGB output. But in this environment, you can definitely see the blurriness is more noticeable. However, it's still readable, even in 80 columns mode. but doesn't look so bad for Super Mario Brothers, for example. Anyway, moving on, it's time to change out the marquee light. Besides the fact that this one was no longer functioning, we generally replace these with LED lights anyway to reduce energy use and maintenance time. Now, because this particular game doesn't have a mounting area behind the light like most games do, we'll have to build our own. My solution for that is just to install a couple of pieces of wood. I typically use the back of the machine to trace out the angle of the top, and then I just cut out a piece of wood to the correct shape. And so, just a quick test fit, you can see where these will mount. The best way to ensure the mounting screws line up is to go ahead and screw the fixture into the boards now. Ashton will go ahead and solder the new wires to the old connector, and then seal it with heat shrink. And now it's time to mount it in place. We're adding some wood glue to make sure this is really strong, and we've already pre-drilled some holes that line up with these pieces, so the final step is just to screw it all down. And while I'm up here, I'll remove this nasty piece of tape. All we need to do now is plug in the light fixture to the existing power line, and then we'll plug in the power and see if it lights up. Ding, 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 we have a winner! Well, if we want to ever see this game work, we're going to need a new main board, and the first step is to get the old one out, which was harder to do than we anticipated. The corrosion has worked its way up into these connectors and essentially glued them in place. You can see what I mean after getting the first connector off. And to quote Technology Connections, through the magic of owning 2 of these, we do have a spare board from the second machine. Interestingly enough, it has the same corrosion damage present, but it appears somebody caught it at a much earlier stage, removed the battery, and then patched up the traces that were damaged. I wanted to at least attempt to remove a little more of that corrosion, so I put some alcohol on it and scrubbed it a bit. Then, after giving it a good rinse, I hit it with some compressed air to dry it off, and, well, there is some improvement in the corrosion situation, but it isn't perfect. Of course, the ultimate test will be to install it into the cabinet, see if it actually works. We did put a little deoxit on the connectors to help with the contacts there. And before we powered on, I wanted to clean some of this trash out of the bottom of the cabinet and vacuum up all of the spiders and debris. In the process, I found this original survey card wanting to know if the game was received in good condition. And it has prepaid postage, so I guess I'd better fill it out. I mean, I can definitely check the no box here, and my comments will be that it had a battery leak, it was full of dead spiders, and dirt dauber nests. I'll just put that out for the mail and we'll see what happens. Most likely the post office will just trash it if it doesn't make it to a valid P.O. box. Joking aside, Ashton's going to plug in the power and we can see if the new board works. Sorry, the light is blinding, so let's turn that off. But we do have something. It's alive! So we tried playing it a little bit. There was no sound coming from the game, so that'll need to be fixed. But what about the pinball part of the game? Well, the flippers work, and the left one moved with such force that the dirt dauber nest just flew right off of it. But there's no ball and no lights coming from the playfield. Guess that means it's time to remove this glass cover so we can get access to that. And looking at the playfield more closely, the question must be asked, do we just try to clean this up or do we order new artwork and replace everything? And here's our dirt dauber nest. Yummy! So we did just some preliminary cleaning with the vacuum cleaner and later a bit of Windex just to get a better idea of the condition of things, and I think it's salvageable. It will require further disassembly, and in doing so we found a second dirt dauber nest. It makes me wonder where this thing was stored for all these years. We got the sound working, by the way. It turned out the volume was just turned all the way down. But now that we have a ball, we can test more of the playfield. And it looks like the various sensors are working and the flippers work, but some of the solenoids are not working and none of the lights are working. I took out a few of the bulbs and I could see that they were burned out, but there must be some other problem since there's like 60 or 70 bulbs in this thing. But the only way we're going to find out is to remove the playfield. That does mean disconnecting a bunch of cables, but here we go. Alright, we can finally examine this more closely, both on the top and the bottom. One thing we knew we needed were new rubber bands for it, and these things are so old they're just falling apart. We went over to the Starship, and Mike Woods dug through his collection of pinball parts and gave us just about everything we needed for that sort of thing. The next thing we did was test these 3 fuses. The first 2 worked, but the third one was blown. So that explains part of our issue. We went ahead and replaced the fuse, although we were still concerned about why it blew in the first place. So we decided to test the solenoids one at a time using an external power source. This one works. This one, not so much. And this one works, but then gets stuck in that position. So we figured we better take them apart and have a look. There's a lot of rust on some of these, so we cleaned that off with some sandpaper. We also cleaned out the sleeves. Afterwards, all the solenoids seemed to be working correctly again, so we put the Playfield back in the machine and retested the game. Everything except for the lights seemed to be working now. Ashton took the Playfield back out and started a complete teardown of the top portion so that he can get it cleaned up and replace parts. In the meantime, I started working on the control panel. I wanted to replace the artwork, but that means removing all the controls. Next came the fun part, which is removing the CPO or control panel overlay. We do this to the vast majority of machines that we restore, and this step alone is far more time consuming than most people realize. It usually takes me several hours to get this completely removed and cleaned up. Once it was finally clean, I gave it some primer. And let that sit for about half an hour. Then came back and coated it with some spray paint. And then this would have to sit overnight to dry though. One of the things that we eventually realized is that every single one of the bulbs in this machine were burned out. Every last one. And here we were thinking there was some more systemic problem, but apparently somebody just ran this arcade without ever doing any maintenance on it up until it just quit working. I got to work cleaning up the side art. Even though it isn't perfect, I felt it was good enough to keep, especially being that this is a melamine coating. And then I found myself wondering what the purpose of this big rusty bolt was. It isn't connected to anything and appears to basically just be used to plug a hole in the side. Maybe somebody in the comments can explain what it was for. Anyway, I used the wire brush on the bench grinder to clean off all the rust, and then gave it some primer. And shortly after, some yellow spray paint. And then I put the bolt back where it went, and I felt that it looked a lot better than a nasty rusted bolt. Ashton used some naphtha on the Playfield to help remove any old wax, and after that, a new coat of wax was applied. Obviously, something we do on every machine is replace the locks so that our master key works on it. As mentioned earlier, at least we had the original keys so we didn't have to drill them out. We switched gears for a bit to work on the cosmetic condition of the cabinet. I started by removing this old Texas sticker. I mean, sometimes I leave these for nostalgia, but this one was mounted so badly with that plexiglass, it just looked tacky. And what's worse is there are other holes I'm going to need to repair right below it. It looks like the last time this machine was legally in service was 1984. I'll go ahead and peel this off, and then I'll use some alcohol to remove the adhesive residue.
So I just wanted to clarify something. So the state of Texas requires those stickers as proof that you've paid your tax, essentially a license to operate a machine that takes money. However, because all of our machines are going to be free play, we don't need those stickers on our machines.
Next, Ashton pulled off the old T-molding. We're going to replace that, but we had to order some. Once the paint was dry, I turned my attention back to the control panel artwork. I purchased a brand new overlay for it. This one had pre-cut holes and lined up pretty easily, making this one a breeze to apply. And here it is, all done. That looks great. Besides control panel artwork, I also ordered new parts for the pinball portion of the game, as you can see here. So, it was time to start rebuilding the playfield. Just as an example, here's an original part that's all faded, and here's the new part. The next thing I wanted to deal with was this front part of the cabinet. I knew we'd need to repaint this section, so that means having to remove the coin door and the speakers. And when I removed the coin box, I found a single quarter laying underneath as a nice surprise. This one is a 1976 bicentennial quarter, And by the way, we created some new jars to show off all the coins and tokens that we found inside of these machines. So I'll just deposit this quarter right here. Okay, back to the coin door. I wasn't sure if I needed to repaint the very bottom section. After all, this has a melamine coating, which is much more resilient to stains and scuffs than regular paint, so I'd like to keep it if possible. Fortunately, other than just a few small imperfections, it appeared to clean up rather nicely, so I wouldn't need to repaint it. I mixed up some Bondo to fill in all those holes though. There were 9 holes plus a few other damaged areas I covered up. The idea is to sand this stuff down to the point you can run your finger over it and not feel where the hole was, even if you can still technically see it. After masking off some of the areas, I used some Kills primer on it. Afterwards, it was impossible to see where the holes were. And shortly after that, I used some yellow spray paint. I think that's going to look pretty good. So I took the masking tape off, and there we go. The front now looks good as new. One other thing I wanted to see if I could improve was the state of these coin return buttons on the coin door. I tried some of the Naval Jelly rust remover on them, and you know, there was a significant improvement. It's not perfect, but I'll take it. At this point, it was time to just start reassembling everything, starting with the control panel. Since Ashton and I aren't really that experienced playing this particular game, I asked Mike Woods to come play it and make sure everything was working correctly. Fortunately, everything was working correctly except for a few lights. So we put it in lamps test mode, and one of the things we could see was some of the lamps were not working. But what was more interesting is that some of them, like this one and that one, are stuck in a sort of half-on state. So I had a feeling this might be a transistor problem. So I had a closer look at the lamp driver board, and sure enough, I found at least one transistor that looked like it had burned up. So my first thought was, well, we have 2 of these boards, so let's just try swapping them and see what happens. And well, it did fix a few of the issues, but then it had a different set of lamps not working, so we just went back to the first board with the goal of repairing it. I looked over the schematics, and fortunately it does tell us exactly which transistors operate various lights, so we removed 3 of the suspect transistors and replaced them. After reinstalling the board, it seems all of the lamps are working except for these here. So we pulled the Playfield out and reseated those bulbs, and sure enough, that fixed those. And so here we are, all of the lights are working. So now it's time for the before and after. So this is how it looked before we started, and now this is after. Another machine is restored and ready for the arcade for you guys to come and play. Hope to see you soon at the Time Rift.